passionate father and stubborn kids. Again, have you ever had a stubborn child? Have you ever had a child that just would not listen? And you talk to them, they just wouldn't listen. And you think that that's just when they're young, but it can happen when they're quite north of 18. Isn't that true? It can. I mean, it is what it is, okay? Now, Luke 15, I was reading a book that Brother, I was given this week, okay? As I got the book was on the parable, okay? Russ gave it to me. Let me look at it. And this particular author was talking about how the parable, actually, he viewed it as like one parable in 3 parts. And that certainly would not be a bad way to look at it because the parables are connected. Some authors look at it by saying, interpreters by saying, the first one really highlights the ministry of God the Son as the shepherd. The second one, the lost coin, more the ministry of the Holy Spirit, searching and seeking. And then, of course, the third one, God the Father, with the prodigal son's father. And those are not bad observations to make, but they do have some merit to them. But we have to, when we look at Luke 15, to draw our attention and keep our attention on chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. Because that's the reason for the parables. Remember, look at verse 1. Then drew near unto them all the publicans and sinners. Remember, the publicans are those Jews that would be considered as those who had betrayed their people and become servants of the Roman government. I was hearing a news article today where they were having that same problem when the Russians came in, and now they've liberated some of that land, okay? And some of what the problems they're having is in the school systems, because some of the teachers, when the Russians invaded and took over certain parts, they started teaching the Russian curriculum, actually went to Russia and trained to teach their way, whatever, and was coming back, it was in the school, and then they were liberated. And now there's a discussion among the teachers who they want to teach with, and a little conflict there. Well, here, this conflict is between these Jews who are now raising the taxes for the Roman government and the other Jews. And then the sinners, that person would have been, not Gentiles, but sinners. And the sinners would have been those Jews who would not keep in the Old Testament law. There would have been countless numbers of Jews in Jerusalem during the time of Christ who had no interest in the law keeping, and they would not do it, and so that's what they're talking about here. And then the Pharisees and the scribes, the Pharisees, of course, those who really trying to apply the law, the scribes, those who focus on the written scripture, murmuring, saying, this man receiveth sinners and eateth with them. Now that's the question. Why is Jesus reaching out to these people in need? And he answers them, okay, with the story of the shepherd, when he said, look, the shepherd goes out and nobody would fault him for that. To leave the 99 and go after the one. Nobody would fault the woman for cleaning the house and just turning it upside down to find the coin. And just like that, you should not question why I would do this. But then the last one, the one of the parable of what's often called the prodigal son, is much more complex, okay? It's much more involved, and it much more has different components to it that have to be brought together in our understanding, okay? Now, the starting point for us is simply this. First of all, the key character is the father. It's not the prodigal son, nor the other son, but it's the story of the prodigal son's father. And it magnifies what he does to try to solve a problem. Now, the interesting thing here is there are 2 problems in the parable. There are 2 wicked sons. One we know gets right with God, and the second one ends in verse 32 with a cliffhanger. Okay? We don't know if he gets right with God. In the story, he doesn't get right with God, but the story ends before it concludes. We don't know. And so you have 2 characters of 2 fathers. The key character is the father. The second, that both sons are seeking to control their father. Both sons are seeking to control their father. Now, it's interesting to note The first son is trying to control the father by getting his inheritance early, which is a significant, painful blow that we'll talk about later. So the first son is trying to manipulate his father by taking the money prematurely, just the money, not the responsibility of the inheritance, because what he would have done is he would have inherited a portion of the land and of the servants and of the business, and he would have been expected to manage it for the next generation, okay? And sort of like if any of you were Downton Abbey fans as far as watching the movie, the series where you had this landlord, and the idea was to keep it for the next generation. And that's the idea here. They were expected to inherit the land and everything else and keep it going and try to increase it for the next generation. He didn't want any of that. He's manipulating his father, trying to control his father by taking the inheritance early. But the second son is also trying to control the father. He's controlling him in an angry fit, trying to get the father to conform to his attitude. So you have the story not just of the prodigal son, but of the angry son. And you have this conflict here. Now you have to understand this whole seeking and saving highlights the unique difference of Christianity. Do you realize the first couple of 100 years in Rome, Christianity was not considered a religion? In fact, the Romans considered the Christians as atheists. Now, why do you think the Romans would consider the Christians as being atheists? Well, they didn't have a God. They didn't bring a God to the table. Everybody else would bring a God to the table with some kind of structure, some kind of physical item. This is our God. Caesar's our God, or this is our God, or this is our God. They would have these idols, but the Christians had nothing. Now, the Jews, they were sort of grandfathered in because Rome knew they couldn't control them if they tried to make them worship Caesar. So they gave them a pass. They had a special dispensation because they knew it was hard enough to control Israel, the Jews, in occupation as it was. If they tried anything else, it would go sideways. But the Christians were considered by many people as being atheists. They were considered as being barbaric for eating the body and drinking the blood, almost like cannibalism. They were not understood. And so this idea of seeking the lost, seeking that which needed to be found, saving the lost, it was a unique concept to Christianity in that time and in that frame. Now, you have two sons. You have the prodigal son and the angry son. And those two we're going to talk about tonight, okay? Now, we're going to divide this up into two sections because I think it magnifies the Christ focus on why he's after people. See, he's after people who are rebellious, that's the prodigal son, but also those who are outwardly conforming, the other son, the angry son. Hey, I've been here the whole time. I go to work in the field every day. Look at my spirituality or my goodness, and he's trying to manipulate. He's angry with the father because the father isn't doing what he wants to do because that anger reflects a wicked heart. And they both are in a bad situation. So first of all, let's just talk about this. First of all, loving the prodigal son. Okay, loving the prodigal son. Now, I do have a conferences I do sometimes at places about parenting adult children. I've done it here before. The messages at different times. Parenting adult children. And I use this as a guideline, even in our counseling ministry, to helping people to think through, how do you handle a prodigal son? Usually if they're 35, you can't put them on restriction. If you ground them, it's quite useless. Or when they're 25 or whatever, they're out of the home. You can't do any of that. What do you do? Okay? What kind of guidelines do you use? Well, you may see a few of those tonight in this study. It's not the main point of this study, because the point is to understand what Jesus was saying here, but it's certainly an application to it, okay? First of all, I want you to note a couple of things. First of all, a loving response. A loving response here. In verses 11 through 19. The father is going to respond with great love in accepting where his son is. Often, when people go astray or go sideways in their life, particularly children, we tend to sometimes get so frustrated with them that we throw up our hands and say, well, but we have to be wise in how we respond. And the father here is loving. But this love is expressed in three responses. First of all, in a suffering response. A suffering response. Verse 12 touches on that. The young man said unto him, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth me. Now, this is a suffering response because what happens here is this. There is pain. What this man is doing is he's going out and publicly defacing his father. He is saying, in essence, I don't want you. I want what you have, but I don't want you. I want your money, but I don't want you. I want what you can give me, but I don't want you. And that's painful, isn't it? I mean, you love your kids, you sacrifice for your kids. Evidently, this father was quite successful. He had servants. He had a fatted calf. He had a great business, and yet his son just wouldn't get out of him. Does that ever reflect how some people view God? They just call on God when they need him. He's the God of the hospital visit. He's God of the funeral home. He's the God of the low finances. He's the guy of the troubling times. But other than that, I don't really want him. I want what he can do for me. That's the prodigal son here. So the father is suffering because he is being humiliated in public. Now, a number of sources I consulted this week in studying the passage afresh this week, and I've studied it many times, was, in two different sources said the natural expected response on the part of the father would have been for him to slap the kid. I mean, just slap him, okay? You say, well, you can't do that. Well, back then you could. And in fact, it was expected. All right? And so he had this, but he suffers the pain, and then he suffered financially because he divides him his living. Now think about this, okay? So the young man was supposed to get a certain percentage of the inheritance, okay? But if you own 30 acres that are valued at $100,000, and you own business equipment that's valued at $50,000, and you have $100,000 in cash, so that's like, what, $250, okay? Well, then you have to divide that up. He just wants the cash. He doesn't want to take anything else with him. Doesn't tell us what the father, what was, but he gave him money. He didn't give him the stuff. Remember, his inheritance was the right to have and possess and use all this stuff. It's like if he's on the Outer Banks, okay, so his dad owned, he owned like 3 restaurants on the Outer Banks. And so at the time of his death, he would get one restaurant to run for his children and his grandchildren. But he wanted this to cash out. And so he is suffering, he has to sacrifice, and it's painful in verse 12. But then in verse 13, there is a surrendered response. Because he then has to accept and surrender to the choice of his son. Not many days after that, the young man gathered together all he had and took his journey and wasted. So he had to surrender. There is, when you have prodigals, a level, a point of surrender where you have to accept the fact that, in fact, you can do nothing about this. Now, I want to be careful here. I understand that the focus is on the grace of the shepherd and the lady getting the coin, and now the father here. But in this case, just as a sidebar application, when you are dealing with prodigals in a loving response, there is love that draws you to suffer at times and then to surrender. And say, you know what? You've chosen to go this direction. I wish you wouldn't, but you have, so that's where you are. Because I can't make it be different. I can't will it different. Now, when they're younger, you can't make a 5-year-old obey, but you can make them want to obey, usually, okay? And even a 12-year-old, not always, but usually you can make them want to obey. You can either bring positive incentives or negative incentives in to play to create enough heat they can see the light, however you want to say it. But there comes a time when a child is of their age and they're grown that you can't do that. And so there's an act of surrender. And then there is an act of waiting. This is a loving response. Now, here's the deal, okay? When you suffer because of a prodigal, and when you surrender to the choices a prodigal makes, then comes a time of waiting. But it's critical to note in verses 14 and 19 that the prodigal, in all of this, the prodigal son's father does not give him a credit card. He does not continue to support his sinful behavior. He allows him, because he has to, he's an adult, to make his choice, but he does not come back in and give him a perpetual supply of money. And I tell parents of grown children, if they ask me, and sometimes if they don't, okay, if I'm preaching on it, okay, or if I love them and they need to be pointed out. You know, if your child's doing wrong and you're supporting that sinful lifestyle, you're not really helping them. So Jack goes up to college and he brings Jill back with him. And well, at college, we just do whatever we want to do. Well, Jack and Jill, you can have the room, but your room's the third room upstairs on the right-hand side. Why would you do that? They're not married. Why would you keep paying for their college bill if they're shacking up? I don't know. That's a decision parents to make, but are you really helping them when you okay? Well, you want some money for some booze? Well, here you go. Whatever you want to go. Okay, I'm just saying there has to. The prodigal son. Look at verse 17. And when he came to himself, he would have never come to himself if his habit had been supported, had his wickedness been supplied in limited resource to do what he was doing wrong. Okay, so the prodigal son's father has a loving response. He suffers, he surrenders, and he waits. He waits, accepting the fact that the son has got to experience some things, evidently, that he would not respond to at home. But also waiting not only for him to have his experience and come to his senses, but also waiting for him to repent. Verses 17 through 19. You see, 17 through 19 is critical here. And it was made possible because a loving father responded proportionately and correctly to a rebellious son. And he's able now to come to his senses. And this loving response in verses 11 through 19 is followed by a loving reception in verses 20 to 24. Now, this reception is different than was customarily happened in those days. If a prodigal son were to go away and disown or embarrass or defame his parents, when he came back to home, he was not expected to come up and nor be greeted by his father. What he was expected to have happen was he would come out to the house and sit out a distance from the house and wait. And wait. And he was given some indication he could come closer. But that happened over a period of time. This, when the hearers, if you were the Pharisees and the scribes, and they would be appalled. If you were the publican and sinners, you'd be excited. Okay. If you see verse 20, And he arose and came to his father. But when he was yet a great way off, the father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck. When they would have heard that, the Pharisees and the scribes said, no, you can't do that. He doesn't deserve that. That's the whole point of the questions in verses 1 and 2. Those publicans, they don't deserve your time. They don't deserve any help, okay? But the father here had a loving response. 4 things to think about his response. First of all, it was a reactive response. Notice he says, I'm going to arise and go to my father. And verse 20, he arose and came. His father didn't go looking for him. And that wasn't very nice. Why didn't he go looking for him? You ever thought about that? They looked for the lost sheep. They looked for the lost coin. But here, the father is not looking for the prodigal son. He is waiting on the prodigal son. You've got to be careful with these parables not to go too deep and drill too deep and try to make too broad a principle. But it is a thought here, at least an observation, that there does that when you have a prodigal, someone who has chosen to say, I don't want you, I want what you can give me. Until they change in what you can't do anything about it. You can't manipulate them. You can't play the game. And so it's reactive. Second, it was expressive. I love that expression. He comes down and last part of verse 20 and just comes and he has compassion and falls on his neck and kisses him. I mean, this is an expressive response. I love you. That's awesome. The person who at some earlier date embarrassed him in the whole village, who publicly put a disclaimer, I don't want my father, I want his money. I don't want him. I have no use for my father. Well, that reflects on the father. What father wants to hear that? But what father wants the whole world to hear that from his son? You know, what's he do? He runs to him. And he expresses his love. The song, he was there all the time. Here he was waiting for his son. Okay? And then finally, not finally, but there's a wise response. Look at verse 21. And the son said unto him, this father was wise because he knew his son needed to ask for forgiveness. I just want to encourage you, whenever anybody wants to ask your forgiveness, I forget who it was. So if it was you, I'm not thinking about you, but I just remember a while back, I had to tell somebody, I'm sorry. And they said, no, I didn't even think about it. Well, I'm sorry about it anyhow. I either said something or acted a certain way or whatever. Maybe it was Karen. And it happens to me on a regular basis anyhow. But anyhow, somebody. Okay. But listen, when you do, when somebody has to say, I'm sorry, well, you don't need to say anything. No, yeah, they do need to say it. If you feel convicted about something, you need to confess. You need to confess it. Okay? You need to say it. And it's a wise is the parent of the prodigal who then, who after suffering and surrendering and waiting, he reacts and he's reactive and expressive, but he's wise and says, yes, okay, exactly what do you want here? Okay? And he confesses it. But then you have the idea of an immediate response. Look at verses 22 to 24. Bring the fatted calf. Now we read that, and it's not the same thing as saying, like, somebody call Domino's. Let's get a bunch of pizzas over here, okay? That's not what this is, okay? This is not even, let's go to JK's tonight, whatever. It wasn't that kind of thing, okay? This kind of thing was different, because most of the meals during this time in this part of the world, most of the meals were vegetarian. They didn't have a lot of meat. And The most expensive kind of meat would have been this fatted calf. This has been like going to J.K.'s. I went there one time. They had some kind of steak that was like $99 or whatever. It was big. I didn't get it, but it was fine. It said that it ages for like 25 days or 30 days or whatever. I don't know exactly what that means either, except maybe it's rotten. I'm not sure what it means. But anyhow, left outside for a couple of days. I'm not sure what it means. But anyhow, it's very expensive. All right. Well, here, this means this was the most expensive meal. And when you kill the fatted calf, remember, you can't put it in the freezer. You can't kill the fatted calf. You think, we're going to cut it up. We're going to have steaks for the next 3 weeks. So we're going to put it in the freezer. So what are you going to do? If you can't put it in the freezer and you kill the fatted calf, what are you going to do? Do what? Fire the grill. Okay. Well, you're going to fire the grill, but then what are you going to do? Invite everybody. Hey, y'all, come on over. I mean, this is like, I mean, they're just having a Babacostal fit right here. They're just, yeah, let's party. I mean, they are celebrating, okay? Okay, now, that's a big deal. It's a huge deal. But it's immediate, and it's public. He wants everybody to know that my son that was dead is now alive. Now, that can be a reference to the fact that in this time that it would not have been uncommon when the events of 12 and 13 take place that the family have a funeral for the son. They view him, it's like dead, okay? They had a funeral because of the response here, but that's the references there. Now you have the loving the angry son. Don't you love it when your son gets angry? Don't you? You ever have a son that goes like, I guess. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. You guys ever have a husband that does that? No, we won't go there. Okay, all right. But sometimes kids can get just so angry. And you try to spank them. And you have to, when you spank them, you have to come to a point of breaking through. So when you spank them, you got to keep spanking them until you get some kind of brokenness there. Okay? If they're just going, well, then we're not done. Okay? Okay, we're not done. Until that changes, we're not done. Okay? Because, well, that's just barbaric. No, it's actually called biblical. But anyhow, we'll go on. There has to be a change. But angry sons are hard to deal with, okay? Now, the setting is verses 25 to 27 here, okay? Now the eldest son is in the field. Remember, the cell phones didn't reach that far. They didn't. He was out there working, so he didn't know what was going on, okay? When you cut up a calf and start cooking it, you don't have time to wait to send invitations here, okay? And they drew nigh to the house. He heard the dance and all that going on. And again, verse 27, thy brother is come, and thy father hath killed the fatted calf. And I'm not sure if the servant here was trying to rub it in or what. You know, maybe this servant liked the one son over the other, or he's just trying to cause trouble. Hey, yeah, your dad's having a party, and he killed the fatted calf, that big one, you know. And verse 28, now he's angry, okay? Now, watch it. How do you respond? How does he respond? First of all, a loving confrontation in verse 28. And he was angry and would not go in, therefore came his father out. His father came out to the other son when he showed signs of repentance, but here the father goes out in the lost condition because of anger, separated by anger, okay? And he entreats him. Now, to entreat has two elements to it. The word entreat, it means to call, to refer, it refers to giving evidence that stands up in God's court. There are two elements to it. There's a begging part, intellectual part. So under that, lovingly confronting him, you might want to write two words, intellectually, and emotionally. So this entreating is both an intellectual and emotional approach, okay? And then notice, okay, the correction, the loving invitation. Because watch what happens here in verse 29. And he answered and said to his father, Lo, these many years do I serve thee. neither trespass I at any time thy commandment. And yet thou never gavest me a kid, that I may make merry with my friends. So what is he revealing in verse 29? His anger is rooted in unfulfilled and an unrighteous expectation that his father would value what he does and give him something. He wanted a quid pro quo kind of relationship. He wanted not a love relationship, but an earned relationship. I've done all this stuff, so you should give me my just dues. Okay? And so this correction requires, in verses 29 and 30, the absence of love exposed. In verses 29 and 30. In 29 and 30, the absence of love, because he said, you didn't give me that. And then verse 30, but as soon as this thy son has come, which hath devoured thy living. By the way, whose money was he devouring? Yes, your living, but my money too. Okay, part of our wealth. Okay, you kill the fatted calf. So I'm angry because God, you're not fair with me. You're not being fair to me. My relationship isn't based on fairness, and you never do want your relationship with God based on fairness. But this man wanted his relationship. And you know what? That's the same problem the Pharisees had in verse 2. The Pharisees said, I am right with God because I do all these things. That's what makes me holy. That's not what made them holy. It made them carnal. So you have the absence of love exposed, but then an invitation to love in verses 31 and 32. And he said unto the son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. Hey, all this is yours. I mean, this all belongs to you. It belongs to us. We're together here. And then he pleads to them, it was meet that we should make merry and be glad, for thy brother was dead. You see, this anger for his father revealed an absence of love for his brother. This is I'm not so sure that this is the more carnal, I don't know if you can say more carnal, but this is the more lost one in the story. He doesn't really love the father. He doesn't even love his brother. He's just sorry. He's sorry. And so he comes here, but he says, is it meet? He was lost, and he's lost, and is found. And then the story ends. It's as bad as Lord of the Rings in that sense. Lord of the Rings is a terrible series of movies that make no sense and are useless waste of time. We won't go there. But I remember seeing the first one, and we were in this big thing and this big event and did a theater and all that, and the thing just ends at the river, and I'm thinking, I paid for a movie. Where is the ending? It was the most ridiculous thing, and we watched the other two. That was equally a waste of time, and if you understand the story, I'm sorry, I don't understand any of it. But anyhow, the point is that it just ends. And here it ends in verse 16. He said, to his disciples, and he moves on to something else, okay? So where does it end? We don't know where it ends. It ends right there is where it ends. So what's the point here? The point is that the prodigal was loved. The one that walks away from God is loved. The one that walks away outwardly is loved by God, by the Father. The one who walks away inwardly, they walk away. They're doing all the right stuff. They're dotting all their I's and crossing all their T's. You know, they come to church Sunday morning, Wednesday night, and they carry their Bible. But really inside, it's all a deal for them. Just making a deal with God. It's not really loving him, but loving what he can do for them. So a couple of questions for you and I. First of all, do we see ourselves pictured in either one of these boys? Either one of you and I at any time. I suspect if we're honest that sometimes we can see ourselves in one or both of those. Maybe both of them at the same time in some areas. But understand that God's love is greater than our behavior. His love to reach out. I was thinking about on the trip Karen and I took today. I had this thought, so I wasn't going to share it with you, not because any reason. I just wasn't going to. I just had the thought. Okay, but anyhow, I'm going to share it now. I said, I really am glad the church pays me. He said, well, that was pretty narcissistic. Well, it could be, but not in this case. It wasn't. I said, I'm so glad that here this 3-hour interruption to my day can be given to give the gospel to people who are in a very bad state and really need the hope of Christ. I'm glad that was an opportunity for us. I want to encourage you, if you're dealing with people who are one or the other, think about what God would have you to do to help them and respond to them as he leads you. When you think of the unsaved, keep this in mind. Don't become impatient. Don't become irritated. Don't become narcissistic. Don't become holier than thou. But love them like the Father